It's a real pleasure to introduce this talk by Margarita Boenig-Liptsin, who provides a great example of the interest of the Paris Institute of Advanced Studies in funding human and social research on the challenges faced by our society. As we will see, Margot's work is concerned with the effects of computing on democracy, opening questions about the role of technical machineries on disrupting or accompanying social change, and on how societies adapt to new technologies. She has approached this question by studying the emergence and spread of the idea of computer literacy through historical studies comparing three countries, the United States, France, and the Soviet Union. In doing that, she has recovered and dissected some fascinating discourses on technology and society from the 1970s, in which we can detect the germ of current criticism of the high-tech society. Her work resonates in many ways with my own research, and also with my research methods and questions. Methodologically, by her interest on transnational and comparative history, as a way to produce strong arguments on the evolution of technologies and their representations. Thematically, I am much interested on the relationship between technology and democracy as well. For example, I published some years ago a few articles on the history of computing in Spain, in which I trace the relationship between the professionalization and politically democratic and progressive movements. This activism led to very specific political results, such as the introduction of the right of data protection in the Spanish Constitution, approved in 1976, which, as far as I know, was the first constitution including such an article. Indeed, my current research also connects with Margot's interests. I am currently working on the history of environmental monitoring networks, which are technological systems for carrying data on the environment. The history of these infrastructures exemplifies the tensions between two visions of technology. One, organized vertically and related to military control and the governance of technological risk, but through risk management strategies, and the other, more horizontal, citizen-based, are more apt to contest government control and fuel controversies on industrial pollution. In both arrangements, computer and human-computer interfaces play a key role. So I welcome analysis such as one Margot presents, which can help to elucidate how these human-machine interactions are built, maintained, and challenged. So I am really pleased to hear your presentation.
Nestor, thank you for your introduction, and I really appreciate the opportunity to get to know you over the course of this year of fellowship at the EOA, and to think together with you about the questions that we share about technology and democracy in a historical perspective with application to the present. So it's really been a gift, one of the gifts of the EOA, to have your partnership in thought. A very crucial question that concerns societies around the world today, concerns citizens as well as their leaders, political leaders in liberal democracies, is how to maintain and strengthen democracy in light of the prevalence of computing in public life. Computing and database technologies and practices like the platform economy, new forms of surveillance, prevalence of social media are seen to transform and, in many cases, worse, threaten democratic institutions. In making sense of the relationship between democracy and computing today, it's important to recognize that the forms that contemporary democracies take are not only results of technological design, black box algorithms, for instance, or economic structures of the present that incentivize certain kinds of content to be shared more widely than others, but also of something that's more deeper underlying our forms of life, which is the constitutions of the human. That is locally valued ways of knowing and being with computers. And these constitutions, we have to acknowledge, have a history. And so the talk that I want to share with you today is to try to take one cut at recovering this history and to see these constitutions of the human information. To do this, I bring archival research and interviews to probe the meaning of programs that we refer to as computer literacy and computer culture, comparatively, in the United States, France, and the Soviet Union. Computer literacy and culture programs of the 1970s and 80s were really the first means by which leaders of the computing revolution around the world sought to introduce the publics, their publics, general lay people, to ways of thinking and being with computers. We might begin with an example from Time magazine, a cover of Time magazine from January of 1983. Each year, Time has a tradition to select a quote-unquote person of the year, and a person who, for better or for worse, has done the most to influence the events of the year. And in January 1983, Time continued and yet broke with that tradition by selecting a cover which announced that the year of 1982 would be not the person, but the machine of the year that they wanted to highlight. What, or better, who is the machine of the year is ambiguous when we look at this cover. Because the cover doesn't just show the machine, it doesn't just show the computer monitor. It really puts in the center of the image George Siegel's iconic sculptures of the human figure. And yet, these figures are also themselves not alone and themselves not the center of the composition. Characteristic of Siegel's sculpture, they are white and anonymous, as if they were merely there to provide the set or the backdrop for the quote-unquote real or alive running machines that are the main stars of the show and which are shown in color and as actual, and more realistic devices. The cover then leaves open the possibility that the new influential celebrity being celebrated in this instance of Time magazine, the machine might actually be a hybrid of the human and the computer together in the new intimate interaction in the home. More generally, this image raises the question, what are these so-called constitutions of the human in the computerized world, where the idea of a constitution refers both to the makeup or ontology of the human being and to the normative laws and ethics according to which people live. The constitution of the human in the computerized world, or in the world of the information age, is what I will be focusing on. And the rest of the talk, I want to begin with some theoretical background, begin with describing where the idea of the constitutions of the human comes from, then present the three national cases that will be the empirical material, summarize the lessons from the comparison, and I hope that in discussion we can together talk about, so what does this story of the 1970s and 80s tell us about our present relationship of computing and democracy? The notion of constitutions of the human derives from the field of science, technology, and society, specifically the work on bioconstitutionalism, which is an idea that there is a, quote, constantly mutually constitutive interplay of biological and legal conceptions of life. This is something that Sheila Jasnov has done a lot of work on. And that, relatedly, transformations to understandings of what life is, which result, for example, from the capacity to engineer new organisms, with biotechnology, require rethinking of law at the constitutional level. And by constitutional level, mean that those most basic relations between states and citizens, where those most basic relations are articulated and agreed upon. At the same time, these biological refashionings take place on terrain already steeped in the norms of constitutions, with, if you will, a small c, the implicit, unwritten, sometimes nominally written rules that are generated by institutional practices that make up the constitutional order in its daily kind of practice and enactment. Computer knowledge and technology are, like the texts of DNA and biotechnology, powerful tools for self-fashioning. They offer individuals the opportunity to transform their bodies, whether through actual implants or merely added-on devices. They alter the senses. They alter our sense of one another and our sense of self. They allow us to form new kinds of solidarities across distance and acquire new forms of knowledge about the world around us. So in many ways, there is no need to distinguish. Well, we can distinguish for analytical reasons and for making sense of things, but in terms of the constitutional power, biotechnologies and data and computing technologies have an equal standing in relation to constitutions. Now, we mentioned this ability of digital computing devices to really enter into the body and transform the human. Let's stay with that theme and think about the idea of the cyborg, because it's a very helpful visual, a visceral one, to think about digital constitutions. A cyborg is defined as an organism that deliberately incorporates exogenous components that extend the self-regulatory control function of the organism in order to adapt it to new environments. This was a term coined by Nathan Klein and Manfred Kleins at a military conference on space medicine back in 1961. And the specific environment of adaptation that they were imagining in this context was how to prepare the human to live, to be, to work in outer space. So it's a very different context. It's not a digital computing context, but the idea of the cyborg is helpful for us to think about digital constitutions because of the two elements that the concept of cyborg brings together. The idea of internalizing or incorporating an exogenous technology, and the idea of using that incorporation in order to make the organism adaptable to a new environment or a foreign environment. The incongruity between the organism and its environment is corrected by technology, but this technology is not like a spacesuit, for instance, sitting on the exterior of the body. It really becomes part of the person. And the incongruity is remedied by transforming the organism to adapt it to that foreign space. So I have found these two aspects, adaptation and incorporation by technology, were also important in all the three cases of computer literacy programs that I study. Even though in the visions, these transformations to the human are significantly more subtle than any kind of explicit intervention in the body. You know, they are not implants, they are not actually transforming the physical body through penetration of any kind, as you might expect in a cyborg. In all the programs, there was a belief that technology needed to become incorporated or become a part of the person in order to adapt the person to the particular environment. And in this case, the environment was the imagined, already there, but yet always on the horizon concept of the information society. So why is this, again, continuing the metaphor of adaptation and incorporation, why is it significant? Because so frequently, computer literacy programs can be thought of as purely instrumental use and learning of computer programs. The abstract or instrumental knowledge of how to operate a machine. But as one French television program that was produced at the time of the French computer literacy movement explained, the goal of these programs, the goal was was to show people how computers were tools to, quote, dream and build lives with. So really a much more intimate conception of the human-machine relationship than just a merely instrumental use one or one of merely knowledge. Let's go back to the idea of constitution now that we've talked a little bit about this specific form in which the computer can be thought to be incorporated and adapt the organism. The departure from bioconstitutionalism to consider the constitutions of the human in the computerized world brings with it new questions. At the same time, some issues that were central concerns in bioconstitutionalism become not as relevant when we're thinking about the digital space. For example, the way in which recombinant DNA techniques cross species and organism boundaries, and in doing so transgress different boundaries of the law, such as the legal distinction between human and non-human, is central to thinking about in terms of bioconstitutionalism. By comparison, transformations to constitutions, both ontological and normative, at least in the cases that I have examined of computer literacy, is significantly less explicit. And yet, as historical actors I study would argue, the computer-wielding human being called for a new era in the definition of a human. So even though the transformations were not actually transforming the organism in ways that could be demarcated and defined in law, or there was a sense that at stake was the formation of a new human. Seymour Papert and his colleague Ira Goldstein wrote in 1976 that they said, quote, "Once in man's ancient past, the notion of using tools to multiply his physical effectiveness occurred. This was a revolution of such consequence that even today, some are tempted to define man as, quote, a tool-using animal. We are on the verge of another such revolution, only this time, the tools are of the mind." So Papert and Goldstein suggest that the definition of the human is at stake in this computer revolution, but this definition is not formally anywhere, of course, set down in law, right? It's not something like that, but it is a sense of the moment that something here revolutionary is happening with the meaning of the human. Computer technologies appear to be subtler, more subtle, more mundane, and in this way also, I would argue, more pervasive than biotechnologies in reforming constitutions of the human. These circumstances make it difficult to bring into focus these constitutions in our own day, despite their proliferation. And to mention just the one example of their proliferation, which at this point in 2022 already feels a little bit outdated, but when Edward Snowden, back in 2013, was revealing the extent of NSA surveillance, it was interesting to observe that both his supporters, so people who said he was doing the right thing, and his opponents who were challenging the fact that he should be revealing these issues, both of them alike pointed to the fact that Snowden was a programmer and that he was involved in geek communities such as Ars Technica, and even the fact that he was of a certain generation, because Snowden was born in the year that Time magazine announced that the machine of the year would surpass the human of the year. Basically, they point to all these factors that align Snowden with certain kind of computer culture to say that this was the reason why he did what he did. This was the reason why he felt the need to reveal the extent of NSA surveillance in the way that he did. And his feeling, his sense of self, his feeling of responsibility, these analysts claim were products of this so-called computer culture. In cases such as Snowden's, we see how debates about constitutions of the human in a computerized world are alive and relevant today. But this case raises many more questions than we can answer, in part because we are so firmly ourselves constituted by this computer culture. And I would argue that since when people were talking about Snowden again in 2013 in this way, we've come a long way and much more. Our problems have evolved, and the forms of constitution of the human and the deepening of these constitutions, I think, are significant in 2022. How does this knowledge of the computer constitute our identity and inform our sense of self and of the world, of our normativity? This is a really core question to I think that needs to be investigated. But it's hard, again, for all the reasons that we just discussed, it's really hard to get at this question. I tried to investigate it through the specific focus on the formation of computer culture as a public phenomenon. And so I would like to now go into the more in-depth case studies of the three countries and how they sought to bring about this public computing culture. I turned to a period that could be called the prehistoric time in computer history, to the 1970s and 1980s. This is a time before the internet, even partly before the personal computer, a time when computer hardware was bulky, when what one saw on the computer screen was minimal graphics, and when a time when people around the world debated the role that this machine, foreign to so many, should play in the education of children and in the formation of the future citizens of the information age. An excerpt from a diary of one young participant in an all-Soviet summer school for programming back from 1978 serves as a dramatic glimpse of the overlapping knowledges and cultures of this world into which the computer was moving into. This student wrote in their diary, "Tomorrow I will go to the all-Soviet summer programming school. My family has slaughtered a piglet for the road." Basically just an illustration of how traditional ways of departure and celebration and journey and new encounters with computers and old forms of marking those encounters with traditions. I want to share with you 3 different visions of how people should know the computer. These come from a combination of politicians, teachers, parents, mathematicians in the United States, USSR, and France, who were all thinking about the need to teach computers to children and designing programs to do so. I will refer to these visions by the names that their designers gave them. So in the United States, the prevalent names were computer literacy and sometimes computer fluency. In the USSR, these programs were referred to as second literacy. And in France, they were known as culture informatique. These visions are all set in a time when the computer is, as I like to describe it, on the horizon, by which I mean that it's at the same time there was a vision that computers and computerization of society would be coming, that the information age was about to arrive. And so there was a kind of an imminence of a coming up in the future. It wasn't yet there. We were seeing glimpses of it, and it was yet to come. And in order to prepare people for that horizon, the computers had to become the horizon themselves, or the steady reference point, a kind of practical and moral anchor for people with which to go confidently into this future. For example, in France, Jean Mahieu, then the president of the Parisian Cultural Centre Georges Pompidou, which hosted an important exhibition in 1985 that reflected on the relationship between technology and society, wrote in an opening to the exhibition catalog that the economic crises of the 1970s, which France experienced and resonated in many parts of the world, was spurred by what he called a, quote, veil of digits that interposed itself between reality and the spirit. The French response to this veil was to actively teach school children and the general public with and about the computer, not so much in order to lift the veil of digits, but rather to make it possible to see the world anew through it. In the US and in the Soviet Union, the computer was similarly seen to be the agent of changes for which people needed to be prepared, and a central element at the same time of the solution or means of preparing them. So that's why it's both about the horizon, the computer on the horizon out there, and the computer as a moral horizon right here already necessary to adapt. The specific ways in which the computer future was articulated and the manner in which people had to prepare for it were different in each country and comprise important elements of the comparative work that I want to show you a glimpse of. So let's begin with the United States. Instead of the French image of the veil of digits to describe how computers had altered reality, American futurist Alvin Toffler described in 1970 how computers contributed to the development of what he called a malady that had consumed his fellow citizens and which he called future shock. Future shock, Toffler wrote, was a particular psychological state resulting from too much change in too little time. There was a documentary made based on this best-selling book of Toffler's, and the documentary was narrated by no other than Orson Welles. And it was a very dystopian film. And in this film, Orson Welles says, again, as the narrator, "We live in an age of anxiety, a time of stress. And with all of our sophistication, we are in fact the victims of our own technological strength. We are the victims of shock, of future shock." Using the striking figure of future shock, Toffler argued in his best-selling book that computer technology had made the future discontinuous from the present. Something that, like a foreign culture, could trigger a psychological state of shock and anxiety for someone who was entering it unprepared. It's as if the future was already a reality in the present, contemporaneous and yet a thing apart, something that stood in contrast to the everyday, to the familiar. Some years later, 3 or 4 years later, Harvard sociologist Daniel Bell gave this future state a name. He called it the post-industrial society or the information society. He was actually building upon Japanese conceptions of the information society, which are, to my knowledge, the official people who coined the term. But Daniel Bell was a really important promoter of this concept in the United States and in many ways abroad. And the information society or post-industrial society, and Bell is ambivalent about the two terms, he uses them interchangeably, is for him a supranational society, so beyond any single nation, resulting from transformations in the means of production, so movement away from industrial production to areas of provision of services and economies based upon information and knowledge exchange. The way that people at the time talked about the information society made it into a strange figure of a society that is imminent or coming in the near future and at the same time already there. The disruptive, discontinuous nature of the information society in this Toffler vision threatened or had already destroyed the foundational constitutions that people held as naturally given. For instance, the relationship between parents and children. And at this time, around the conversations around the information society, there are a lot of explorations by sociologists, psychologists about the generational relationship between grandparents, parents, and children, and the relationship between the past and significance for the present and the future. A lot of grappling with shifts at this level of generations and temporality. This is captured also in Toffler's film, which at the end shows a scene where a baby and an elderly man are both visible in a shot, and yet both seem to be unable to understand or help one another. They're both in trouble, and they don't seem to be able to connect or to share a lived reality. Other Americans echoed Toffler's characterization of the problem as a kind of a generational, temporal, psychological one. For example, Edmund Berkeley wrote in an editorial piece of his journal, Computers and People, quote, "People are not adapted to the kind of life they live now. They do not have mind enough to solve all the problems which face them. They urgently need to supplement their minds, and the partnership between people and computers is likely to fill this need." So here was, again, a presentation of a problem of biological adaptation, which has been created by runaway technology, and now requires that same culprit that created the problem, the computer, to itself become the object that transforms people's minds in preparation for this new society. What was needed to respond to this problem was to recover a sense of control over the runaway machines. This involved, Toffler explained, the development of an agile and flexible character that could keep on learning to adapt to a rapid and ever-changing environment. Some scholars refer to this capacity as learning to learn, and the ability to have foresight, to anticipate the future. Many believe that the computer could help to train and develop these qualities of mind, both flexibility and learning how to learn, and a certain foresight, capacity to anticipate the future. This importance of adaptation underscored the point that one wasn't born into the information society, and you couldn't just become a citizen of it. You had to be transformed as a person in order to become a citizen in the information society. And children and young adults were seen to be particularly key to leading this adaptation, to being able to change. And many saw the need to make changes in the school and the university to reflect this goal and support the next generation in making the adaptation. It was precisely thinking about the role of the computer in education that the concept of computer literacy first surfaced. So a bit about the context of this term, computer literacy. In 1972, Arthur Luhrmann, who was a physics professor at Dartmouth University, coined the term computer literacy in an article titled, "Should the Computer Teach the Student or Vice Versa?" And that title really summarizes the main gist of Arthur's argument, that for him, he saw a problem with the approach to using computers as tutors. And at the time, there was a form of computers in the classroom called computer-assisted instruction, or CAI. And in this model, computers were programmed with academic content, entire lesson plans in math or literature, for example, and then used for drilling and testing students in an individualized fashion, adapting to the students' specific knowledge in these different, subjects. But nevertheless, just drilling them, posing them questions. Luhrmann wanted computer literacy to be an alternative to that CAI model. He argued in this paper that by making the computers the subject of learning rather than just the means of delivering instruction, students would be able to control computers. He likened teaching students how to control computers to teaching the general public how to read and write, hence the idea of literacy. This metaphor of knowledge of the computer, using the metaphor of literacy, he said, this new way of knowing the computer would constitute a new kind of literacy, computer literacy. This parallel between reading, writing, and the knowledge of computers is really central to Luhrmann's proposal. And I think it's really crucial to take it seriously and investigate this word, literacy. To be literate traditionally means to know how to read and write and to be generally educated. Historically, literacy has been related to the development of a particular kind of human being and citizen in a nation state. From Plato, who spoke of literacy as a kind of patterning of the soul, to Marshall McLuhan, who wrote a really beautiful book, which I'm currently rereading because of all of its rich insights, and where he has a thesis that society dependent upon the written word rather than the oral is really a different kind of entity with different sensibilities and different forms of political order. We know that literacy is precisely that kind of tacit knowledge that shapes human beings, our practices, our relations, and our societies. There's a really interesting image if you go to the museum, Musée National de l'Éducation in Rouen, in France. An image from a 1900 French classroom where a teacher is standing in front of the classroom of students and teaching them how to correctly write with a pen, teaching them calligraphy or writing. The rudimentary exercise of learning how to wield a pen, the foundation of literacy, in a manner that's deemed both beautiful and correct, becomes, in this image, also an exercise in corporal and moral discipline. On the blackboard, we see the words, plus fait douceur que violence, be more gentle than violent. The message on the blackboard hangs over the scene as at once a moral lesson, right? Be more gentle than violent as a human being. A tip for how to correctly hold the pen, be more gentle than grasping it firmly, and a model for calligraphy for the student to aspire to, because the way that the message is written, a form in which it takes is itself form of beautiful calligraphy, deemed as a model for how to write. Literacy is not only tied to the formation of moral capacities of the individual, but inevitably and inseparably also to the formation of the citizen, the member of society with certain rights and responsibilities. And there are many examples of this from history in different contexts, but a very stark one is when the United States, roughly from the 19th century, the 1890s to 1960s, implemented literacy tests as a prerequisite for voting. And of course, these literacy tests were not just checking the technical skills of being able to read, but they were laden with normative conceptions of what do you have to know about the state in order to vote. And of course, they were laden with conceptions of the kind of person who is able to and should be tested and who shouldn't be tested. So we see literacy in history tied up in profound ways with moral and political values. Thus, literacy sits at the intersection of these two meanings of constitution that interest me. It's both a technical knowledge that makes up a person, forms their way of thinking, shapes their sensibilities, and serves as a normative frame according to which a person lives. And also, not just an individually normative frame, but constitutes a social fabric of kind of mutual collective life that is essential. Given the significance of the idea of literacy, I want to return to the way in which Luhrmann drew upon the concept. Luhrmann's interpretation of the history of literacy resembles popular accounts of literacy in his time from the 1960s and 70s in the United States. An important characteristic of these accounts is how they portray the phonetic alphabet as a technology and the knowledge of how to use this alphabet in reading and writing, that is literacy, as a, quote, intellectual technology. So the alphabet itself is a technology, and when you induct a person into its uses, you teach a person how to use it, it becomes an intellectual technology because it transforms the mind and becomes a tool for the mind. Luhrmann applied this interpretation of literacy to computers, calling for the knowledge of the computer to be recognized as, quote, an intellectual resource or an intellectual tool. And of course, this isn't just Luhrmann, there's many parallels both to the history of artificial intelligence and then to later articulations, very popular ones by people like Steve Jobs, who kind of insisted upon this intellectual tool quality of computers. Luhrmann also echoed the emancipatory and progressivist thesis of public literacy, that giving the general public, quote unquote, access to this intellectual technology enabled Western economic and social development. So there, in this account, in this very progressivist thesis, you give this intellectual tool, it allows certain economic outcomes, it leads to the creation and sustenance of a scientific criticism and accumulation of knowledge, supports the scientific method, and then is followed by industrialization and the formation of Western democracies. It's a very big weight given to literacy and public literacy. Of course, we know that such an account needs to be taken with a grain of salt because there have been equally significant critiques of this view that center and discuss how literacy is actually about homogenization, a form of violence, imposing particular ways of knowing onto vulnerable populations, and far from emancipatory in the way that some believed. But Luhrmann, when he takes the tradition of computer literacy, he really sees this as this kind of empowerment, emancipatory, democracy-building tool. The term computer literacy peaks in popularity in the United States in the early 1980s. So it's a pretty short history from 1972 when it's invented to mid-1980s when its rise is at the top. It had national attention at this time, although what the term meant differed, whether it meant knowing how to program, knowing how to type, knowing word processing. Most definitions of computer literacy understood it in general as learning how to be in control of the computer. And many organizations who advocated for and developed public programs for justified their activity by saying that computer literacy was the ticket to becoming the citizen of the information society. The person who most fully exemplified this wish to use the computer as a tool of the mind to transform the way that people learn in order to bring about transformations in society, but also specifically in the institution of the school, was a scholar from MIT, a mathematician and computer scientist, Seymour Papert. And I want to conclude soon the story of the United States with just a few words about Papert. As a student of Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget, and working in MIT's artificial intelligence lab alongside psychologists and AI scientists interested in creating an artificial mind, Papert emphasized the development of the child's individual mind. He had studied children's development with Piaget, and he was interested in how it works and how it can be adapted with computers. Papert praised the new capability of the computer brought to advance he praised the new capabilities that the computer brought in order to advance what he referred to specifically as fluency of learning. He believed that learning with a computer, learning with computational objects, such as some that he developed, like Logo, the programming language, or an accompanying little robotic turtle used with the Logo programming language. He believed that learning with these tools could be more compatible with the human mind and the way that it develops, more compatible with human psychology than the way that learning took place in American schools at the time. Papert envisioned computers to enable a kind of seemingly unmediated learning that small children we praise them as being capable of. He believed computers could make learning math and other subjects as quote unquote natural as learning French in France or learning how to dance in a community samba school. This kind of quote unquote fluent learning would be the solution for Papert to Toffler's idea of a shocking future that is like a foreign culture. By learning with the tools that he developed specifically for this purpose, such as Logo, one could domesticate this technological future to become part of this future world and be adapted to that world and speak the main language of this culture, that is a form of speech, a fluency of computers. In sum, the American approach was to adapt the individual's mind with the intellectual technology of the computer by becoming computer literate or learning fluently with the computer. By knowing the computer in this way, one hoped to acquire a flexibility and capacity for learning to learn that was perceived to be really necessary to be a citizen of this anxiety-inducing information society. When Andrei Yershov, a Soviet mathematician and computer scientist, who was the leader of the field of computers and education in the Soviet Union, and one of the most important individuals for preparing all-scale Soviet educational program in computers. When he thought about the future of the computer in Soviet society, he saw a practical problem. He saw a shortage of programmers to program the growing number of varieties, growing number of types of computers. Yershov repeatedly described what he saw to be a strong limitation on the benefits that computers could bring to society if there were not enough people to operate them. And that would, in his descriptions, create a bottleneck for production and for the utility. This way of seeing the problem of computers in the future supported the idea that people needed to be trained as partners to accompany the computer so as to ensure a good future for both. Because people's good future was dependent upon the effective integration of these machines into economy and into society, and they had to do their part. The computer needed people, and people needed the computer for each to realize his or her own productivity. And the productivity of the person, as well as the machine, was really core to kind of essence of human and social being in Yershov's and in the Soviet imagination. Yershov also used the term computer literacy, as the Americans, to describe his vision for training people with a computer, but it meant a different thing for him than in the American context. To become computer literate for Yershov meant to learn how to program or to think algorithmically. This was really key. To be able to plan one's actions in order to achieve a particular goal. Yershov called this knowledge second literacy. Instead of focusing on literacy as an intellectual technology that empowers, democratizes all kinds of human capacities, as Luhrmann had thought and as Papert had put into practice, Yershov considered traditional literacy, and by extension computer literacy, as really a natural capacity of the mind and of the person. This perspective was consistent with how Soviets interpreted the Soviet literacy campaigns of the 1920s, and which took as their foundation the idea that literacy was really natural to human beings and just had to be done, en masse. By calling programming the second literacy, Yershov drew attention to the fact that it came after the first, and also that it was part of human destiny and natural to the person to program, that it would be, if you will, like second nature. Yershov described how programming was part of human biology, of human society, and the main mechanism by which people learn. In one publication, he said, actually in a presentation in UNESCO, he said, yes, we live in a world of programs and are continuously programming ourselves without realizing it. So the vision that programming is in everything from our biology to our societies to how we learn was core to his view already of the person and of society. He described genetic programs written in genetic code that run the body, and at the macro level, how our organism is full of programs that enable predictions to be made about behaviors of organisms. He explained how programs run society, giving the example of a nation's production and how it's dependent upon programming and planning. He explained even morning routines, what you do when you wake up in the morning, from the moment the alarm rings to the moment you start work, as a kind of form of programming and requiring an effective plan and program to carry it through. He described cleaning procedures in the same way, how one goes about cleaning a home, starting from what, finishing with what. And he even described problems in society, social problems of the century, as he called them, like absenteeism or passivity, as problems of a lack of adequate programming. So learning second literacy developed the character traits of human beings as natural programmers and as programming as a normative activity, because it developed their decisiveness and foresight, which, according to Yershoff, were key to an active life of a position and the cure to contemporary social ills. Because he considered programming to be so innate to the human being and to society already, learning how to program formally was a way to master one's own nature. In this account of programming, the computer is not seen as something foreign or something that brings about a large disruption in society. In fact, it's the opposite. It's part of continuity. And it's a speeding up progressive manifestation of that continued state of being always already programming. And this is in big contrast to a lot of the American view, in which, right, the future shock of the information society. The foreignness and otherness of the computer is constantly rejected in the Soviet context. For example, in a film called Game with a Computer, there's a contrast between a figure from science fiction, which is a man with strained, moist eyes, who is seemingly like a cyborg that wears a computer behind a metal band. There's a contrast of this image of this strained, stressed cyborg with a vision of the computer as, quote unquote, one of us. That is familiar and part of regular everyday reality. Other popular films from the Soviet context at the time, family films like The Adventures of Electronic, reinforced this idea by portraying the indistinguishable double of the robot and the real boy. So in this film, there's a little boy, and he has the same double who looks exactly like him, but who is in fact a computer. And in the film, constantly the roles of the boy and the computer are reversed. The robot goes to school in the boy's place, and frequently the robot appears to be much more humane than the little boy, better social, more respectful, better son, better student, more considerate and kind. So there's just visceral sense of friendship, partnership, and humanity of the computer. Yershoff and his colleagues worked to advocate for and prepare for the introduction of computers into all Soviet schools, reinforced the symmetry between the human and the computer. A telling image illustrates the symmetry, which image shows a schoolgirl sitting, sharing a desk in the classroom with a robot. And this image adorns the cover of one of the main texts where Yershoff and his colleagues lay out the program for what to teach in the preliminary general education programming course. Yershoff considered the professional programmer as a model member of the society, whose skills, whose ways of thinking, and values would be transferred to the entire population through these kinds of educational programs. And he sees the programmer as someone who is incredibly close and intimate with the computer. He used sometimes the analogy of the Holy Trinity, that the programmer feels himself to be, as he said, quote, the father creator of a program, the son and brother of the machine on which it runs, and the carrier of the spirit, which infuses life into the program-machine combination. And then realizes as a result that vision of society where human machines partner in order to provide the benefits, both social and economic, to all. Another metaphor that Yershoff used was that of a jockey and a horse. So the person would be the jockey who's very in tune with the horse computer, quote unquote, knowing fully the possibility which the machine affords. And I think we can extrapolate from this metaphor also has a sense of care and even love for this. It's not a utilitarian relationship, but it's really a strong, deep partnership, an intuitive one. So the development of second literacy in everyone, beginning with school children, would only make, in Yershov's view, the computer more familiar, more effective, and able to more effectively realize the human computer as partners, working side by side to realize one's and their collective greatest productivity, which is also both the humans and the computer's programming essence, or programmed essence. So finally, the case of France. Like the Americans and the Soviets, the French also recognized the importance of knowledge of the computer to become a full citizen of the société informatisée, or literally informatized society. But to gain this knowledge required to evolve French culture as a whole, rather than developing the individual's mind, which was the American way, or teaching technical skills so as to be a productive partner in the Soviet way. Furthermore, while in the United States the responsibility to adapt fell upon the individual, in France the responsibility was really collective, because without a whole collective kind of culture transforming, the individual's knowledge of the computer didn't matter as much. The French launched a national campaign to develop the nation's culture informatique, or informatics culture, in 1970. And one of the reasons for this timing was in part because it was a response to May 1968, to the student protests that raised concerns about the hierarchical and centralized nature of French society. The term culture informatique was the preferred way to refer to these programs. Interestingly, I've asked informants in France repeatedly about whether alphabétisation informatique was ever a word. And apart from being an awkward thing to say, they said that yes, there was that word, but always the tendency was to gravitate towards culture informatique. And I think that's not an accident. The idea of culture informatique stems from a broader idea of culture technique. Culture technique was an idea born in the 1950s from the work of anthropologist, archaeologist André Leroi-Gourhan and philosopher Gilbert Simondon, who wanted to draw attention to the role of technical artifacts, everything from the knife to the bicycle and the car, in human history, and argued for a particular vision of the proper relationship of people to their technological environment. They and their followers, who started subsequently a culture technique movement and a journal in 1979, encouraged people to come to know technical objects rather than use them passively as quote-unquote black boxes, whose inner workings they did not investigate or question. The proponents of culture technique argued that only this kind of knowledge of the technical artifacts would enable the human being to avoid feeling alienated by his or her environment, and, put it more positively, would really fulfill human being. Leroi-Gourhan and Simondon understanding of the human being as someone who really becomes human through the process of creating and relating to tools. That's how it was core to their vision. In other words, they saw technology not just as an external tool for human use, but essential to humans to be fully human. Thus, Simondon said that culture in culture technique is not knowledge, but, quote, an ethical relation éthique, with the object, a sentiment of respect, care, love for the technical object. Scholars like Xavier Goucher, who studied culture technique and the work of Simondon and Leroi-Gourhan, describe how behind the culture technique movement lay a vision of a quote, technological humanism, an idea that the human being becomes fully human only through the interaction with technical objects rather than fearing the technical's intrusion on the human. The culture technique movement was an idea about the proper relationship of the individual to society as much as to technical objects. As such, it served as a normative vision of social order. One of the central ideas of the culture technique movement was that mere quote-unquote familiarity rather than knowledge leads to feelings of alienation. where a person perceives that the technology takes away their jobs, that it is a determinate force in their lives. In contrast, real knowledge, or maybe we should say ethical relation with technology, empowers the person by showing them the ways in which they have capacity to influence the technical world, and more than just technical world, to really participate in the very human process of world making, to act in the world, and by acting upon the technical, intervene in social and political life. And this is part of the reason why culture informatique is linked to the malaise of 1968 moment, because it's seen as an answer to the problems of alienation and this, feeling of incapacity to have the power to act. This culture informatique, deriving from culture technique, seeks to instill in people the proper relationship of objects that allows them to be proper creators, political actors in the world, and creators of technical artifacts with that. Culture informatique drew upon this background of culture technique. French advocates for culture informatique were members of the culture technique movement. Other people, like President François Mitterrand, shared its foundational idea of the proper knowledge/mastery of computer technology, shared the idea that this knowledge was key to democratic participation and effective decentralization and self-management, which were values for Mitterrand at the time in society. So behind the idea of culture informatique is a similar wish to know the technology in order to be able to control its directions and consequences and to make worlds with it. Unlike in the American case, however, where the control of this technology was not up to each individual unlike in the American case, where this was very much an individual pursuit, transformation of the individual mind in order to prepare that person, individual, for this future state of the information society. Here, there was a very collective dimension to this culture technique. It's a collective movement, and equally an important responsibility of the state to organize the proper relationship of culture technique, informatique, and bring it about. With President François Mitterrand's support, a well-known journalist and politician, Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber, opened in 1981 a computing center in the heart of Paris known as the Centre Mondial et Informatique et Ressources Humaines, or CMI for short, CMI. It welcomed visitors of all ages to play with and experience computers on its open show floor. On the second floor, upstairs, it invited top international computer scientists, including Seymour Papert and his colleagues from MIT, Nicholas Negroponte, to set up research labs with the eye to social applications, such as healthcare and agriculture. Beyond its physical presence in Paris, the CMI also designed and operated quote-unquote social experiments in regions of France, as well as abroad, notably in French former colonies, to study and inform human interaction with computers. The CMI was presented by the French and international press, as well as by its participants, as a move towards the realization of the socialist goal for informatique. One article soon after CMI's opening proclaimed its goal to be to ensure that, quote, knowledge be accessible to everyone, and that the thought of the world not be structured one day by computer memory. So here are elements of culture technique, right, to support the accessibility of everybody to the project of participation in society, and to prevent a kind of technical determinism of society, and rather make it about mastery and knowledge and proper relationship through technical artifacts. The article's author hoped that the CMI would help to democratize knowledge and keep people in control of it. The implicit expectation of the author that the CMI would help to make knowledge more humane recalls Mitterrand's own statements that appropriation of informatique by an autogestionnaire society would make computers into tools at, quote, the human scale. In support of this goal, the CMI's central aim was to develop the French person as a ressource humaine. In one televised interview, Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber said that he saw this quote-unquote same struggle for individual freedom and autonomy at stake in both the decolonization of Algeria through war and the decolonization, so-called, of the French through computerization. Servan-Schreiber saw people to be colonized over themselves And in this view, this restricted the French people's autonomy to create their own destiny, to build their lives and careers. The process of decolonizing the French with the computer promised to bring back all the freedoms assumed to be the individual's inalienable right, as well as to lead to a general state of blossoming and fulfillment of each person. At the same time, of course, as linking up and the person to the collective in an effective way by making them a, quote, ressource humaine, a resource for who. In the case of the decolonization of the French and of the people around the world with the development of the informatique, culture informatique, with the computer, we see once again a clear example of incorporating a technology, but in a way that does not emphasize the individual transformation of the mind, as in the American sense, or the extension of the familiarity of the computer as a person, as a programming expert in the Soviet sense. Rather, here we see the computer as an object that shares cultural space, and that the state carefully manages the process of familiarization with it so as to lead to a desirable collective socio-technical outcome. Now that we've seen the three cases, we can just sum up comparatively what are the similarities and differences. We've seen three different perspectives of what it means to know the computer, or more specifically, how to incorporate the computer into oneself, and how this incorporation is a strategy of adaptation to the information society in progress and to come. Now, the interaction of these two elements, I have been comparing incorporation, forms of incorporation, and forms of adaptation, is what determines the so-called model that we can discern in each cultural case, national case. So in the case of the United States, computer literacy and computer fluency, we see a kind of, I think, closest idea to the cyborgian embodiment model, where the cognitive dimension, cognitive augmentation for general purpose, specifically for purposes of being a good learner, learning how to learn, and having that ability to have foresight and adapt to the future quickly is present. There's a normative constitution or idea of the citizen that informs this model, and that is the idea of an empowered individual, drawing back from thinking about literacy as already an intellectual tool. Computer literacy enhancing that empowerment, emancipation of the individual with technology. And the view of the computer and the relationship between the computer and the future is such that the computer is imagined to dramatically transform the future, creating an anxiety and requiring this individual preparation and change. In the Soviet case, it's a different story. We have, with second literacy, the really vision of a partnership with the computer. I would describe this as a skills-based partnership model. The normative constitution, the idea of the citizen that informs this model, is the view of the person as a productive member of a programmed collective, and the centrality of programming already there in Soviet society, even before computing. Computer and the future, the relationship between the computer and the future is such that then computer is imagined to be really in step with society, not a big transformation to the future at all under control and in tandem with where things are going and where things have come from. In the French case of culture informatique, we have what we might refer to as the culture model. This is a very collective vision. And it's not just culture in the sense of collectives, it's also culture in the form of knowledge that is required for the adaptation of the person to the information society. It's a form of knowing as well as feeling, as an ethical relation, as Simondon said, as much as it is a new form of skills, or a new set of practices. The normative constitution that informs this model is the idea of a person who partakes in a shared common culture, in a strong role of the state in managing that relationship and making sure that that relationship is aspiring towards a good life for the citizen. And the vision between the computer and the future is such that the computer is imagined as potentially a large transformative force in society, but the state, and not just the state as government, but the state as collective entity of people, can and ought to guide this transformation. They can and ought to make this transformation smooth with the proper preparation. And they do draw upon a lot of historical knowledge and thinking about the proper relationship to technology. That's very specifically French insights for this project. Through this comparison, we see that the normative constitutions particular to each nation, or more specifically, the imagination of the good citizen, is reflected in the particular way in each national thought about the right way to know the computer. So the history of computers becoming personal and public around the world is a history of aspiration, of designing technologies and practices of use in ways that would help individuals and society not only to overcome contemporary challenges faced in the present, but really to achieve their full potential in the future. The varied ways in which entrepreneurs of the different societies imagine their futures with computers suggests that more than tools of the intellect, the personal computer is a tool of the imagination. When we take a close look at what being computer literate or cultured means in 3 different cultural, social, political contexts, we discover not the harnessing of computing power itself, but rather the possibility of seeing society differently through the role that the computer and the knowledge of it would play. The imaginaries of public computer literacy are at one level diagnostic tools of society. They reveal how societies perceive their weaknesses and their sources of decline. But the imaginaries are also of futures that societies have tried to strive for, revealing what they value and allowing us to discern the commitments that societies have to the people who live in them. So that's all for the historical bit. And thank you, Nestor, for your patient listening. And I hope we can discuss.
Thank you very much for your talk. Very stimulating and very rich in ideas and possibilities of research, future research. And if you allow me, I would like to simply to put you two questions about that. I think we can. I have more than 2 questions, of course, but I think we are limited in time, so I will focus only on 2. Well, as you know, historical discourse is a situated discourse, historically situated discourse. So it's relevant not only to reconstruct history per se, but also to understand better current situation. So my first question will be how your case study, in which way your study talks about the current situation, about current relationships between human and machines, and particularly computing. This in relation basically in two questions, in 2 directions. One is about the continuities and discontinuities, temporal, also spatial, in this story. The other is relationship with the political agendas, because as you see, you have shown the different national contexts, with different also political agendas related to some discourses. And I would like to know how to know more about how these discourses connected with political agendas of specific actors, in particular those of the state and the ideas of order, and also about discipline. I think it's very inform a lot of these discourses. This is the first question. Second will be about a concept you exposed in the introduction. This was about the constitutionalism. I think it's a very important concept to frame your research. And connecting also with contemporary situation, as you know, recently in Saudi Arabia, citizenship was awarded to a robot, a woman robot, if we can talk about woman gender in this case. And it's just interesting that was this recognition of some constitutionality of this machine. It was given just in a totalitarian state, a non-democratic state. And in which sense you can integrate also, talk about this kind of constitutionalization of rights for computers, even if this can be also interpreted as like of show up more than a real giving rights to this person, and in the context of your research. So.
Nestor, thank you for listening, and you really touch upon a point that's really key to my interest, which is not only generally how does history and historical work speak to the present, but also specifically in this circumstance, what do we learn about, about our current state? We might call our interest somewhere between computing and democracy in the present and this history. So to answer this, I want to recall a colleague and good friend of mine, teacher also of mine, professor and historian and STS professor, Catherine Carson, who taught me a very interesting perspective on history. I would be curious to know your thoughts on this too. That history is not the study of events in the past, but it's really the recognition of the fact that human life unfolds in time. And it's the study of that dynamic of human life lived in time and linked to another very core piece of human condition, narrativity. You know. Now, I keep thinking about this way of thinking of history, right? And there are multiple ways in which this comparative history of computer literacy can come to matter if we think about history in this sense. For instance, if we think about history as a trajectory, which moves from one era to another, which can ask questions like, where did something come from or where it's headed? Then we can look at this history and see how maybe in our contemporary society, you know, in our contemporary state of interaction with one another, with technologies, some of our presence must have inherited the work, the plans, the visions of that time, of the 1970s and 80s, right? Because many of the people who are today, for instance, the faculty of computer science, you know, the leaders of the fields, they were younger students at the time in the 1970s and 80s. They were partners to Papert or Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber or Yershov. And then if we think about the public also, some of us as children had these early computers in the classroom and the early programs that ran. So there is a kind of continuity. There's a trajectory from that time to the present. And yet, again, I think this is the beauty and remarkability of the fact of human life unfolding in time. There are discontinuities, profound discontinuities of our present situation compared to the past. So on this view of history as a trajectory, I think I don't have a conclusive answer, but I think to answer the question of what are the constitutions of the human today and how do they relate to the ones that I've been trying to characterize would require another research project that focuses on that question, right? Especially since there's a gap in the research between the 80s and the present. But what I think we can begin to see from the historical is that the present moment is not defined by the present tools. It's not defined by recent events like Cambridge Analytica or you know, the kind of algorithms that we have today in social media. It's not defined by these it's not only defined by these contemporary moments and contemporary technologies or contemporary economies that motivate certain forms of technical use. It has these longer undercurrents. The trajectory is longer. And it goes back to and touches forms of literacy, the layering of the text to the word, to the image, to code. It goes back to institutions and raises the significance of institutions like school in the present moment too, or government in the present moment as well. It forces that, it focuses our attention on investigating the role of specific culturally grounded local ways of being and knowing and how they are in dynamic interaction with technology. So that's a piece. I want to share another element of history. So you can think of history as trajectory. You can also think of history as a pattern, which then kind of asks questions like, what's familiar? What looks similar? Where have we seen this before? And in that case, I think my comparative historical story focuses our attention on the role of knowledge and the problem of knowledge in our contemporary democracy in the digital age. Because so much of the malaise of the moment can be described as feeling like people, as if publics does not know what goes on inside the black box of the algorithm, as if the public does not know, how the AI risk score is computed or how text analysis works, right? There's this sense that knowledge, lack of knowledge, deficits of knowledge frequently ascribed to the publics are the cause of the problem with mistrust or polarization or or populism even, yeah? And the way that that's magnified by democratic kind of public sphere that's digitally mediated. And I think if we think about the problem of knowledge in the present as a kind of element of the present democracy computing debate, we see through then my history that knowledge is never just instrumental and technical. Knowledge is really about becoming and being an ethical agent and a social being, right? So what's the significance of the human-technology interaction? What would a democracy strengthening form of knowing today, accurately knowing, social media or knowing AI look like? And then another way, again, just to finish with this, I thought of, because this question really interests me, so I thought about it in advance. There's another way to think about history. So we thought of history as trajectory, history as pattern. Another one is to think of history as alternatives. And then questions like, when or where have things been different? Or what do we learn from the differences that we see across time? Or could things change again come to mind? And here we see significant differences with the way that things, of the present, with the way things are in the past. For instance, a really core element of this history, comparative history I was telling, was the role of the person and the fact that the person who could become computing, right, a computing person, was the vector for social change. And I think today we don't have either sides of that equation. We don't have the attention to the individual person as the mechanism of social transformation in relation to computing and democracy. And we don't have really vision of what is a desirable social state or what is a, kind of an information society of the future that we want to prepare people for. Both sides seem to be under-articulated. What do you think?
So you think recovering these discourses in the 70s can help us to reimagine the future? I think
it points to the fact that we're missing somehow that clarity, and would allow us to identify opportunities for intervening and influencing that state. Maybe we should think about what would AI literacy look like? Not, again, in a technical sense of teaching people how to write, code, but what is public AI? What would a program look like? What would it entail?
Coming back to the basics, to rethink again.
Yeah, because that moment was such a virgin moment, if you will, I think, when things were open and new and we created these big visions. But your point about the second question you ask about rights and computers and that's also very dear to me, in part because of historical trend, because the history I tell is so grounded in the early artificial intelligence movement and the contemporary artificial intelligence conversations about general AI and about these incredibly powerful new language text-based models. Like just in April of this year, Google Research published, that it had trained its, I think it's called Lambda text model on 500 billion variables. I mean, that's just, it's hard to think of these numbers and scales. And as a result, these actual, entities which some of their creators describe as demonstrating capacities of knowing and understanding to our best understanding of neuroscientists' way of thinking of what we as human beings undergo when we know and understand something. So really, in many ways, there's still the question of what is the relationship of these machines to humans, and are they becoming human in a certain way? That would require new forms, as you say, new kind of transformations to foundations of our legal and social practices in order to make sure that these newly sentient entities have the rights that they deserve. So, I mean, on the one hand, I believe that those questions are important to be asking. The questions about general law and about the sentience of these powerful new AIs. And I think it's always valuable to enlarge our mental understanding of what is intellect and where it's located, that it's not only in the brain, that it's also in society, that it could be in a machine. But I've always found much more compelling thinking about the partnership or the interaction between the human and the computer. And the fact that the site of meeting the person and the computer, that's where kind of my interest lies, and my interest in kind of our constitutional order lies. Not as computer becoming sentient and like a person sentient over here, not these kind of two camps, but forms of collaboration, cooperation, which we are already enmeshed in. Because I really believe that we are already, in these cyborg hybrid relationships with these machines. But I'm curious, yeah.
I think, excellent. No, if you think about this last point, it was some of the ideas behind also the pioneers of Soviet computing.
Yeah. Constantly thinking about this dynamic.
Well, I think we will leave this here. Well, I think we continue discussing later, but for the video, I think we will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nestor. Thank you for being patient.